Alan Charles Coors is professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. He is a leading historian of the 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, and perhaps the foremost exponent of the conceptual revolutions that swept through France during that period. He is currently editor-in-chief of the Oxford University Press Encyclopedia of the Enlightenment. Dr. Coors is consistently noted in various student surveys as among the best professors at Penn. With these and other distinctions, one would think that Professor Coors would be cherished and rewarded by the powers that be at the University of Pennsylvania. But you see, there's a problem. Professor Coors passionately believes that freedom of speech, religious liberty, and the claims of conscience should be available even to the despised minorities that offend political correctness at Penn and at other American colleges. And he has backed up these passionate beliefs with passionate actions. And so far from being lionized by those powers that be, many obstacles have been placed in his way, but I'm happy to report that he has overcome them all. Alan Coors has been there to take on the president, or the then president of the university, Sheldon Hackney, in the famous water buffalo case, saving a young Jewish student from expulsion on trumped-up charges of racism. He has been there to expose the double standard at Penn's invitation to Andres Serrano to display the image of Christ immersed in urine. Asked Professor Coors, what would the commissars of political correctness have done were Holocaust victims or Martin Luther King immersed in urine in such a display? Well, no answer was possible. Alan Coors has been there to document the activities of university thought police in his acclaimed book, The Shadow University. Since its publication, some 700 victims of official political correctness in the university contacted him and his co-author. In response, he and the noted civil libertarian Harvey Silverglade have founded a nonprofit organization called FIRE. The new group, which is what, 2 years? 3 years now, it's amazing, is dedicated to helping just those victims who fall short of cases of litigation and who feel and who are in fact helpless before the official powers that hold them on university campuses when they're trying to exercise their conscience. The part of FIRE's success has been the remarkable coalitions of political liberals and political conservatives who serve as a coalition on its board of advisors, so that when FIRE speaks, it speaks from across the entire philosophical spectrum with a moral authority that causes university administrations to react. Sir John Templeton asked ISI to establish honor rolls for the best colleges and the best professors in America recently. The selection committee was heavy with Nobel laureates and other notables. It will not surprise you to hear that Alan Coors ranked at the top of the Templeton honor rolls. The student who nominated Alan for this honor wrote, Professor Coors is Penn's moral conscience. Wittgenstein once wrote that a very good way of defining something is to point to it. You've studied it in your philosophy classes, ostensive definition. And if one of the young people in the audience today were to ask me to define moral courage, I would point to Alan Coors. Even if Alan had never written a word, instead of course the very distinguished and far-ranging publications that he's penned, but if he'd never written a word, in the example of moral courage that he provides to the inquiring eyes of the new generation, truly he has written upon eternity. It's my privilege to introduce our close friend and ally. Professor Coors will this evening address the question, is this still the age of socialism?
Thank you. It is always a privilege to be here at ISI, and seeing you in uniform, it is a distinct privilege to be able to address you, and I thank you for your service to this country and your service to the cause of human liberty. Yesterday was the 50th anniversary of the death of Joseph Stalin. That largely went by unnoticed, which ought to give us pause for thought. In the wake of the Holocaust and the ruins of Nazism, anti-Semitism lay low a bit, shamed by its actual exercise of state dominion. In the wake of the collapse of communism, socialism too lays low for just a moment. Its means of power, however, remain in the convergence of two achievements: liberal free enterprise and political democracy. The former creates wealth that has transformed all human possibility, but that gives rise to deep envy. The latter allows ambition a democratic route to seize and redistribute wealth. The bounty of free enterprise leads the unproductive to believe that such wealth is a fact of nature, there for the taking. Communism was consequential socialism, socialism that could do what it wished. It seeks always the abolition of private property, profit, and voluntary exchange, that is, the fruits of human invention, thought, risk, talent, and labor. It means central planners who allegedly know what people need and how to satisfy those needs. Socialism is very easily understood by any child. It is taking other people's stuff. It is the slaughter of the goose that lays the golden egg. That story is enduring precisely because it reflects something so deep in human nature. To end the appeal of socialism in this or that form, one would have to eliminate envy, coercion, and political ambition from human affairs. But that would be in another world. The full dream and millennial religion of 19th century socialism perhaps no longer moves either masses or masters, but its underlying impulses and values remain potent. Politicians and demagogues still appeal successfully against property, profit, economic liberty, and the market. After the wall fell in Germany, Lionel Jospin and his Socialist Party swept into power in France in alliance with the Communist Party on a platform of reducing the work week at the same rate of pay. After the wall fell, the third way has achieved such prominence. One of the abandoned ways being reliance upon the economic liberty of voluntary exchange. After the wall fell, the U.S. was drawn toward the central planning of health care. To believe that the future will be less susceptible to demagoguery, envy, and the myth of planning would be a foolish act of faith. It is by no means clear to whom the future belongs. In 1951, the great Ludwig von Mises, who in the 1920s had predicted everything that would occur in socialist economies and countries, warned the West not to confuse rivalries among the various statists with the greater ideological conflict of our age, the struggle between supporters of a free market economy and supporters of totalitarian government control. Mises was wrong in historical context to minimize in any way the singular evil of the Bolsheviks. In the long run, however, he was right that freedom depended ultimately on the outcome of the struggle between private property, voluntary production, and voluntary exchange on the one hand, and central planning and massive government power on the other. Friedrich Hayek, another prophet of the 20th century, and Mises were at one in believing that central planning had an ultimately totalizing logic. Both understood, in contrast to almost all contemporaneous Western intellectuals, that the more complex a society and economy, the more impossible and incoherent was the task of central planning. Without the price mechanism to reflect the choices of individuals, there was no way to discover and allocate economic knowledge or to harmonize the activities of disparate actors toward human satisfaction. Such things could only be done by coercion, absent a price mechanism. And both understood that central planning placed us, in Hayek's phrase, quote, on the road to serfdom, end quote. In the late 1920s, communists began to distinguish between socialism and communism. Departing from Marx, who used the terms interchangeably, communists argued that socialism was a transitional stage between capitalism and the final communism. In some sense, Hayek's The Road to Serfdom, 1944, was a sustained argument that indeed even democratic socialism could only be an unavoidable transition toward the almost total abolition of economic, intellectual, and moral personal liberty. At the heart of this argument lay Hayek's chilling, inductively correct, and remarkably prescient chapter, Why the Worst Get on Top. It was, he argued, no accident of time or place that the concentration of power over all life in a centrally planned economy and society attracted and rewarded the aggressive, unscrupulous, and demagogic, who would attract around them the simultaneously submissive and ruthless. Central planning would bring forth leaders who took power not as a necessary evil or temporary phase of their lives, but as an end in itself. Economic power over the whole life of other persons, Hayek judged, centralized as political power, created a society of slave masters and virtual slaves, in which a leader's decisions about the good of the whole overrode all individualist ethics and law. In such a society, those limited by ethical prohibitions would flee power, and those, in his phrase, literally capable of everything, would rise to high positions under a ruler whose primary passion in life was to be obeyed. There were institutional and psychological reasons why socialism with authentic political power must lead to tyranny and cruelty. Hayek's analysis never has been the view of political Europe or of intellectual America. The collapse of European communist regimes will not entail disillusionment with the substance of socialism under other names until the latter is identified and linked to the catastrophic experience of the former. There is no reason to believe that this has occurred. The very first wave of significant disillusionment that swept across Europe and the West in response to Stalinism in the 30s was that it had not succeeded in accomplishing the Bolshevik dream. By contrast, in the case of Nazism, there were no significant works that spoke of disillusionment because National Socialism had failed to fulfill its ideals of tribalism, exclusive and expansive nationalism, racism, the corporate state, and the Führer principle. The anti-communist texts of greatest appeal to Western intellectuals, however, reached the conclusion that communism had failed to achieve its rightful socialist ideal. Many of these works touched profoundly on individual being and morality, but not one concluded on behalf of classical liberal society. George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, 1938, denounced communism as bourgeois. His Ineffable, 1984, touched on the personal liberty of the private soul, but not on the economic liberty that has been its greatest friend. In his Animal Farm, the final tragedy was that the leadership of the revolution had become just like the bourgeoisie. The most celebrated anti-communist work in the West was a set of essays published in 1949 as The God That Failed. Every one of those essays concluded, however, with a rejection of an economically liberal society. The great Arthur Koestler compared his time in the Communist Party to Jacob being deceived, finding himself with Leah, not Rachel. Communism had presented itself under false appearances. He hoped that he, like Jacob, would be given after appropriate labor the reality of Rachel. Ignazio Silone, the great Italian anti-communist, spoke of his faith in socialism as being more alive than ever in me. Socialist values were permanent, and on the basis of them one could found, quote, a new way of living together among men. The great black author and anti-communist Richard Wright found the communists, quote, blinded by too much oppression. And he concluded, quote, I shall be for them even though they are not for me. The French author André Gide was disillusioned with Soviet communism because he concluded Stalin's Russia was, quote, the same old capitalist society. Stephen Spender, the English poet and anti-communist, called for a double rejection. He assured his readers that no criticism of communism removed the arguments against capitalism. Indeed, he concluded, quote, America, the greatest capitalist country, seems to offer no alternative to war, exploitation, and the destruction of the world's resources, close quote. That was the most celebrated anti-communist book of the post-war period. Socialism almost never has been judged as a goal and value by the experience of communism in power. Ironically, the Marxists themselves always asked that forms of human society be judged not by their ideals, but by their living incarnations. Let us do that. The goal of socialism was to reap the economic, cultural, scientific, creative, and communal rewards of abolishing private property and free markets, and to end human tyranny. Communism, with command of the state, sought to create that socialist society. What occurred under the inhumane tyranny of the worst on top? Lenin, Stalin, Mao Zedong, Kim Il-sung, Ho Chi Minh, Pol Pot, Castro, and on and on. Above all else, there are the bodies. One cannot discuss the past, present, or future while they surround us unacknowledged. We are surrounded by slain innocents, and the scale is something wholly new in human history. This is not the thousands of the Inquisition. It is not the thousands of American lynching. This is not the 6 million dead from Nazi extermination. The best scholarship yields numbers that the mind must try to comprehend. Scores and scores and scores and scores of millions of bodies all around us. Gorbachev's right-hand man, Alexander Yakovlev, entered the archives during Perestroika. He writes in his own book that there were 60 million slain in the Soviet Union alone. If we count those dead of starvation from the communists' ability to experiment with human interactions, 20 million to 40 million dead in China alone in the course of 3 years of the Great Leap Forward, we may add scores of millions more, shot, dead by deliberate exposure, starved, murdered in work camps and prisons meant to extract every last fiber of labor and then kill them. And the widows and widowers and orphans. No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more slaughtered innocents and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. They are all around us. No one talks about them, honors them, or does penance for them. No one has committed suicide for having been an apologist for those who did this to them. No one pays for them. No one is hunted down to account for them. It is exactly what Solzhenitsyn foresaw in the Gulag Archipelago, quote, no one would have to answer. No one would be looked into. The West accepts an epical, monstrous, unforgivable double standard. We rehearse the crimes of Nazism almost daily. We teach them to our children as ultimate historical and moral lessons, and we bear witness to every victim, as well we should. We are almost silent on the crimes of communism. So the bodies lie among us, unnoticed, everywhere. We insisted upon denazification in 1945, and we excoriated those who tried to temper denazification in the name of new or emerging political realities. There will never be, and there never was, a similar decommunization, though the slaughter of innocents was exponentially greater, though those who signed the orders and ran the camps remain. In the case of Nazism, we hunt down 90-year-old men because the bones cry out for justice. In the case of communism, we insisted, as the New York Times editorially demanded when Lithuania thought about accountability, that there be, quote, no witch hunts, the title of the Times editorial. Let the dead bury the dead, but the dead can bury no one. Our artists rightly obsess on the lesser but still immeasurable German Holocaust, which lasted several years, and when we watch Night and Fog, Shoah, or Schindler's List, and countless other films, we weep and we rededicate the humane parts of our souls. The greater communist Holocaust, which lasted decade after decade, the great charnel house, slaughterhouse of human history, That brings forth no such art. It's one tender, modest film, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich from Solzhenitsyn's novel, is almost never replayed and cannot be found for purchase. But that communist Holocaust should have brought forth a flowering of Western art and witness and sympathy. It should have called forth an ocean of tears. Instead, it has called forth a glacier of indifference. Kids who in the 1960s had portraits of Mao and Che on their college walls, the moral equivalent of having hung portraits of Hitler or Goebbels in one's dorm, now teach our children about the moral superiority of their generation. Every historical textbook lingers on the crimes of Nazism, and everyone draws a lesson, and everyone knows the number 6 million. By contrast, it is always the mistakes of communism or of Stalinism, repeated by mistake again and again and again. Ask college freshmen how many died under Stalin's regime, and they will answer even now, thousands, tens of thousands, the equivalent of believing that Hitler killed hundreds of Jews. The scandal of such ignorance derives from an intellectual culture's willful blindness to the catastrophe of its relative moral sympathies. Chile offered refuge and asylum to Erich Honecker, the tyrant of East Germany who wanted the tanks in the streets at the end. Everyone said it is time to bury the past without bitterness. But then Chile clamored for justice for General Augusto Pinochet. On the same day, Spain indicted Chile's Pinochet for crimes against humanity and welcomed with honors Fidel Castro, while Castro's critics or any group that annoyed the tyrant lay dead or rot in prison or tried to recover from the deadly work camps to which he sent them. Most of Europe has outlawed the neo-Nazis, but the French Communist Party was from 1999 to 2002 part of a ruling government. One may not fly the swastika, but one may proudly hoist the hammer and sickle at official events. In most of Europe, the denial of Hitler's dead or the minimization of the Nazi Holocaust is literally a crime. The denial or minimization of communist crimes, on the other hand, is an intellectual and political art form. The Khmer Rouge of Cambodia enslaved the nation and slaughtered a fourth to a fifth of the entire Cambodian population, as if an American regime had slaughtered some 56 million to 70 million of its people. The consensus today about Pol Pot, however, who learned his politics in Paris from the French left and who was the darling of the communist Chinese, is that he was a creation not of his beliefs, but of American bombing on behalf of anti-communism in Indochina. The bones of Cambodia and the millions who risked death to flee communist Vietnam and Laos for an uncertain life anywhere else tell us about the moral value, though not necessarily the military tactical wisdom, of the anti-communist cause there, too. But anti-fascist is a term of honor, and anti-communist still a term of ridicule and abuse. So the dead lie among us, ignored. but anyone with moral eyes must see them, spilling out of television and movie screens, frozen in pain in our classrooms, and sprawled unburied across our politics and our culture. Socialism, wherever it had the power to plan a society, to abolish private property, to attack economic inequality and the allocation of capital and goods by the voluntary exchanges of free markets, culminated in the crushing of individual economic, religious, associational, and political liberty. Its collectivization of agriculture alone led to untold suffering and scarcity and injustice. At its best, it was the ability, through fear and slave labor, to build Gary, Indiana once, without the good stuff and without the ability even to maintain it. Socialism in power produced murderous inefficiency, arbitrary inequality, cronyism, enslavement, concentration camps, torture, terror, the destruction of civil society, ecological disaster, ethnic hatreds, brutal secret police, and systematic tyranny. Everywhere it ruled, there were, beyond our ability to comprehend their courage, those who endured solitary confinement, sleep deprivation, the sadistic infliction of pain, or slow or rapid death because they said no, or because they criticized, or because they would not denounce their friends and colleagues, or simply because they annoyed, for whatever reason, even a joke, a communist with power. To be moral beings, we must acknowledge and bear witness to these things until socialism is confronted with its lived communist reality, the greatest atrocities of all recorded human life. We live in its age. There is no sign that this will happen. The pathology of elitist Western intellectuals has committed them to an adversarial relationship to the very culture that produced the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of bounty and opportunity in human history. That pathology is one of the deepest flaws and tragedies of our society, and with each passing decade, it becomes coarser and more detached from any principle of reality. That pathology allows Western intellectuals to step around the Mount Everest of bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, an act of contrition, or a reevaluation of self, belief, soul, and mind. For them, the victims of communism are mere abstractions. We and our children are educated, entertained, instructed, and informed by individuals who do not see this unspeakable mass of bodies, but at best see only words about them. Faced with the accomplishments of their own society, however, Western intellectuals have the sensitivities of the princess and the pea. In the midst of unparalleled social mobility, they cry caste. In a society of unparalleled bounty, they cry either poverty or consumerism. In a culture of ever more varied, self-defined, and satisfying lives, they cry alienation. In a society that has liberated women, racial minorities, religious minorities, and sexual minorities to an extent that no one could have dreamed possible just 50 years ago, they cry oppression. In a society of boundless private charity, they cry avarice. In an economy in which hundreds of millions have been free riders upon the risk, knowledge, and capital of others, they cry exploitation. In a society that broke on behalf of merit the seemingly eternal chains of station by birth, they cry injustice. The intellectual manifestation of that pathology was and is a collective delusion that ignores both history and ethology. It is a belief that kindness, stable order, justice, peace, freedom, legal equality, and mutual tolerance are the default state of things in human affairs, and that malice, disorder, violence, coercion, slavery, legal inequality, aversion to difference, intolerance, and cruelty are the aberrations that stand in need of historical explanation. Getting those defaults precisely wrong, Western intellectuals fail to understand and appreciate the form of society that has given us the ability to alter those defaults. They believe both that the most productive human cultures are almost wholly dysfunctional, and that evolved, successful societies may be redrawn at will by intellectuals with political and cultural power. They write as if relative pockets of Western poverty should occasion our astonishment, when in fact the term, until recently, for almost infinitely worse levels of poverty, was simply life. The Marxists, as noted, had at least one argument right. We should judge systems in their actual history and practice. In unspeakable bad faith, however, they applied that measure to everything except what they claimed mattered most to them. From one end of the earth to the other, Marxist intellectuals, propagandists, professors, and apologists never contrasted the existing socialist world with the more or less liberal societies of Western Europe and North America. They contrasted instead a fictional perfect society that never was to an existing imperfect society that in fact had accomplished wonders. Marxists were fond back then of denouncing such anti-realism as philosophical idealism, living in ideas alone, and they condemned it in others, but they, in fact, were the most anti-realist of all. An appraisal of the socialist reality could have occurred again and again in the past 3 generations, and those very few who did it well should be among the lionized intellectuals in our midst or memory. In fact, they remain the most marginalized. The chasm between what central planning and liberal society brought us should be the most studied phenomenon of our times. One looks in vain for such study in our research textbooks, schools, and universities. Historians who do the so-called economic and social history of capitalism still teach the world's greatest liberation and enhancement of life as the history of repression, regimentation, degradation, and waste. The humanities at most of our universities have become schools of oppression studies in the very societies that have extended more freedom, choice, and bounty than humanity has ever known. What should have occurred after the fall of the Berlin Wall? For almost 50 years, America had sacrificed its wealth and at times the lives of its young to contain armed communism. Its brave pilots risked their lives by skimming the hills of Western Europe to the great annoyance of German picnickers whose liberty depended, in fact, on such sacrifice. Its submariners left behind comfort, family, and friends to make full deterrence real. Its men and women in uniform stood at places of peril, willing to risk their lives for our liberty. The West did whatever it had to do to prevent the armed Bolsheviks from achieving tactical or strategic superiority. It sustained its will and its great burden of debt, even when its artists, college students, professors, authors, and filmmakers turned against the alleged folly of such efforts. It obsessed on communism and anti-communism. It was haunted by its own and its enemies' bombs, missiles, and nuclear strategies. This was the burden it chose to bear. And then, in a seeming miracle, the fatal weaknesses of tyranny, central planning, and illiberalism at a moment of American will were actualized in the collapse of European communism. Now we could assess and do a real accounting of what we had fought to preserve and to prevent. There was and is no rush to do the assessment and comparison that should be the most urgent and welcome intellectual and moral task in an America suddenly free of its long heroic charge and of its worst fears. What might an optimist have expected? An anti-communist epiphany, a festival of celebration, a flowering of comparative scholarship about them and us, a full accounting of the communist reality, political, economic, moral, ecological, social, and cultural, a rededication to the principles that underlay from our side the differences, a set of profound, anguished, and soul-searching mea culpas, admissions of guilt from all those who without malice had been tragically wrong, a revision of curriculum, a recognition of the ineffable value of a truly limited government and of free men and women. Examine any one of these perfectly reasonable expectations, and the data are grimly discouraging. Imagine if World War II had ended with a European Nazi empire from the Urals to the Channel, soon armed with nuclear weapons, in mortal contest with the United States, in a peace kept only by deterrence. Imagine an evolution from a Hitler to an Albert Speer Nazi. Would the children of the left have led songs of "all we are saying is give peace a chance" beneath symbols of unilateral disarmament? Would American opposition to Nazi influence anywhere, let alone to Nazi securing of bases in the Western Hemisphere, have led to domestic charges of our being the imperialist world policeman? Would our intellectuals have mocked or cheered a president who used the phrase, "the evil empire"? But what were the differences between that totalitarianism and the other? Deaths, camps, the desolation of the flesh and the spirit. The bodies will not be buried without an answer to that. How mute we were in 1989 during what should have been at the least the celebration of the world's of the celebration of the fall of the world's most powerful hammer and sickle, symbol of the ultimate human slaughter. If it had been the Third Reich swastika that had fallen after 2 generations of Cold War, the joy and catharsis would have lit our cities. So ask our cultural intellectuals, do they believe or disbelieve what Solzhenitsyn wrote so directly about the Soviets, quote, that no other regime on earth could compare with it, either in the number of those it had done to death, in hardiness and the range of its ambitions, in its thoroughgoing and unmitigated totalitarianism. No, not even the regime of its pupil, Hitler, close quote. After generations of conflict between 2 systems, where now is the excitement of comparative scholarship? The economists, the cultural scholars, the ecologists, the historians, history has opened a vast terrain to them now to study the difference in real terms between private property and communist commons, between markets and planning, between individual rights and collective purpose. How extraordinary that we do not have an intellectual assessment of who was right and wrong and why in their analyses of socialism and socialism in power. We live in an era of appalling adult bad faith. Where is even the effort toward an essential empirical and moral ledger? A great book, The Black Book of Communism, with the world's best scholarship, had a minor influence in France, which still returned the Communist Party to ministries and to power. Where else? It has never penetrated American life or even college bookstores, when it answered, in fact, the question that should have been on everyone's mind. What will we teach our children? What was at stake? Was deterrence? Was risk worth it? Who knew what, when? In my children's high school, in a conservative school district, after the Berlin Wall fell, they did a week on the Cold War. It featured the paranoid anti-military film Fail-Safe, and their textbook explained how the saintly Gorbachev led the cowboy Reagan down the road to peace. Those who depend on our media and our films do not know. The strength of even relatively free enterprise and even relatively limited government will ensure that our civilization lives on, prosperous and strong by any historical standard, but it is doing so without self-belief and without moral understanding of its extraordinary place in the drama of human life. And it is doing so without accounting for the scores of millions of dead and for the societies and beliefs that butchered them. You put private property ahead of people remains a potent curse, as if the former were not essential to the well-being, dignity, liberty, and lives of the latter. You put profits ahead of people remains of equal force, as if profits were not obviously the measure of other people's satisfactions, of want and desire. Indeed, it is precisely to avoid the revitalizing of classical liberal principles that our teachers, professors, media, and filmmakers ignore the comparative inquiry that the time so urgently demands. It is precisely because of the lessons that would be taught by knowledge that no revision of curriculum occurs, for at least a generation. Intellectual elitist contempt of liberal society has been at the core of the humanities and soft social sciences. This has accelerated, not changed, since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And our children do not know about the bodies. When we examine ongoing communist regimes, however transformed, how can we not be informed by history and the bodies? Again, a monstrous historical double standard prevails. When the right-wing Jörg Haider achieved democratic political success in Austria, the governments of Western Europe made him a pariah, an outcast, for his symbolic ties to the Hitler of 2 generations ago. Fine. And the ruling communist heirs of Stalin and Mao, in terms of death and suffering, the Laogai, the concentration camps of China, should be more infamous than the concentration camps of Germany and German conquest. And in some ways yet more extraordinary because they are with us still. By the most serious estimates, perhaps 50 million individuals have passed through them, few emerging. In North Korea, with its nuclear arms, a nation starves because of the madness and self-indulgence of its communist planners. Realism in new contexts may well counsel normalization of relations with some of these murderous regimes, but with eyes open, with fraternity toward the victims, and with moral lines we will not cross. Listen, in 1945, when Eisenhower heard that the German residents of a nearby large town didn't know about a death camp whose stench should have reached their nostrils, he marched them well-dressed through the rotting corpses and made them help dispose of their dead. I wish we could do the same, but we lack his authority. The great Czech writer Milan Kundera stated the moral reality with clarity. What about those with good intentions, he asked, in The Unbearable Lightness of Being, who didn't know, who acted in good faith? Kundera found the one genre appropriate to that question, tragedy, and he turned to the story of King Oedipus. Quote, when Oedipus realized that he himself was the cause of their suffering, he put out his own eyes and wandered away blind from Thebes, unable to stand the sight of the misfortunes he had wrought by not knowing. He put out his eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes, close quote. Let the socialists and apologists acknowledge the dead, bury the dead, and atone to the dead. Otherwise, let them be forgiven only when they have put out their eyes and wandered blind away from Thebes. And let elitist Western intellectuals learn the words of Requiem, written during the Stalinist era by Anna Akhmatova, the greatest Russian poet of the 20th century, quote, I will remember them always and everywhere. I will never forget them, no matter what comes, close quote. The bodies demand accounting, apology, and repentance. Without such things, the age of communism lives. It is up to your generation to do something about that. Thank you very much.